Hello everyone, and welcome to the video blog by ITSS Verona. My name is Omer Brunner, and I am the team lead of the Middle East team at ITSS. Today with me is Ofer Idels. Ofer is a Minerva postdoctoral fellow in the history department at Munich University. His book, Zionism, Emotions, Language, and Experience, was recently published by Cambridge University Press. Hi, Ofer, how are you?
Omri, I'm fine. Thank you for inviting me.
Ofer is with us today to discuss the role of history in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we have some questions for him, and hopefully he can elaborate also on his new book that we mentioned in the introduction. So let's begin, Ofer, by saying that when we're talking about history in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we actually go back to biblical times, so thousands of years. Can you give us some context and say if there are other ongoing conflicts you know of that go back this far?
Thank you, Omri. That's a good question. I think it might be good to make it a little bit clear that the conflict itself, of course, doesn't go on for thousands of years or from biblical time. The conflict itself of the between Jews and Arabs, later on Israelis and Palestinians, is a very concrete history, which is a modern history. It goes back to the end of the 19th century, if you want to, or even to the end of, or even to the start of the 20th century. So it's a very, very modern and recently recent or at least modern conflict of something like 100 years. Having said that, of course, 100 years is a long time in our current global world, which sometimes conflicts are pushed to the sides or not that in the news of so much. So often it seems that the conflict is larger than it is, maybe, or is sometimes a little bit ahistorical. And in many ways, the fact that both of the narratives are of this conflict, the history takes us thousands of years back to the past, is part of the problem or part of the issue that makes solving this specific historical contemporary conflict much more complicated.
Because we see other conflicts around the world and we can trace their history to much more recent times. And even the conflict in Northern Ireland, let's say we trace it a few hundred years back to the split in Christianity between Catholicism and the Protestant movement. But when people are claiming their right within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the claim actually goes back literally thousands of years, or at least 1500, about 1500 years to the time of Islam, the establishment of Islam. So we're seeing a much more quote unquote ancient conflict than other conflicts, and as you say, it makes it harder and more complex to reach a common ground in terms of historical perspective, in terms of rather a historical narrative.
Yes, and if I will say it a little bit even more bluntly or provocatively, I would say that history is part of the problem, or the fact that the narratives of both sides of this conflict at the moment are taking us to history thousands of years into the past and arguing ethical questions, like for example, is it a promised land or not? Whose land is it? Who's owned the land, or whose land is it was promised to? In that way, it creates both two narratives, which history cannot resolve. But in the same time, there is this paradox in which we go to history in order to try to get an answer to the conflict about how to solve it, or at least who's right in the conflict. Instead of focusing much more on the present and the future and how do we want to solve this conflict.
I think that's a very, very important point. And actually, it segues us very nicely to the second question I have is why should we care about history at all? At all? What can we learn from history in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and just in general?
So that's of course a very big question, and also a question that which in general, not only in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Middle East, but all over the world there is at the for one we have this paradox. From in one hand, we are believing, feeling, we are sure that history is important. We like history as modern identities, but on the same times, we although on the one hand we are sure that history is important. It has meaning. But on the other hand, it's not that clear to anyone today in the world, even not professional historians, to explain to you why history is matter, or why should you learn it, or what kind of history we should learn. Uh, um, in terms of the particular Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I would say, I would say it provocatively. I'm believing history is currently a problem uh, when trying to solve the conflict, uh, because we're going to history in order to find ethical questions. We believe if we know what happened, what really happened in the past, we'll know how to solve the past and shape the future. That is not necessarily the case. And again, we cannot say that the new president or the upcoming president in the United States is very known to not know a lot about history necessarily. So in paradox, that might be his advantage, not a disadvantage, I believe, in going forward. But we'll
That,
see.
that's very, very interesting. To hear from a historian to say that history is a problem. I would rephrase what you said. I would say not that history necessarily is the problem, but rather what people make of history or the history that people imagine or put together. But even if I don't rephrase it, history can be the problem because it is very vague in the sense that what is right, what is wrong, what happened, what didn't happen. Absolutely. And sometimes in reference to President-elect Donald Trump, sometimes ignorance is a bliss. So he can say, I really don't care what happened 100 years ago. I don't care what happened 1,000 years ago. This is what's going to happen from now on. Um, and you know what? We will have to wait and see what happens in terms of his
Exactly.
policies. But there is an element there of maybe ignorance is a bliss. Going forward to more modern times, can you talk about Zionism and the Palestinian national movement vis-a-vis one another?
Yeah. So if we agree on the contents that uh, history is nationality is a modern phenomenon, which we sometimes call an invented phenomenon, or imagined communities, an imagined phenomenon. So it's if we agree on on that view of nationality as a whole, we can say that both Israeli identity or Zionist identity beforehand and the Palestinian identity are both two modern phenomenons that evolved one one uh, one next to the other in a series of reactions and counter reaction in the last in the last hundred years or so, since basically since this first Zionist settlement in Palestine during the end of the 19th century. Um, uh, so
It's
yes,
really
uh,
it's two movements that fed each other, right? So they fed
yes,
off each other both in terms of development and but also in terms of conflict.
in
So
terms of course.
what
Uh,
happened here then happened there or in reaction to and so on and so forth.
Yes, of course, we can think about it like in, I'll just say, making the relatively long history of the last 100 years a little bit short to fit our time. I'll just give two major examples. On the one hand, the image of the place of the army and the place of the soldier in Israeli nationality is, of course, pivotal on the one hand, and the place of the soldier in Israeli nationality and the army, of course, was completely different if the conflict was had different proportions to Israeli existence in this. And on the other hand, the place of what they called resistance in Palestinian nationality is also a very pivotal part of their nationality. So it's of course so again we have those two conflicts but those two conflicts are those two national themes of the nationality, elements of the nationalities of course, are a result of reaction and counter reactions that are made during historical times, historical circumstances.
Right, right. And can you speak about reactions and perceptions throughout history to Zionism, from how it was first perceived to the UN's resolution against Zionism in 1975, declaring that Zionism is a form of racism, to modern times where it is perceived as a modern colonial philosophy?
Yes, and taking challenging this question from the end. So yes, of course, Zionism today is, in at least in some circles, very much connected to colonialism. But again, we should ask, like, for example, how wide is this? How wide is this circles? Or uh, uh, so even so, what I would try to say that even going I would say two things. First, that even if we look at the present, it's not that necessarily clear that everyone can has a good definition of Zionism, or that it's everyone has necessarily a very strong opinion in it. Okay, if again referring again to the American elections, it's not that clear that the position that connects Zionism with settler colonialism is that popular in the US, for example, or in Europe. On the other hand, on the American right, there is a large movement of separatism, which does not necessarily see Israel or Zionism as kind of an ally to American values or interests.
Mhm.
Um, um, Having said that, the question of like, but having said that, I think it's very much clear that Zionism today is much less a consensus than it was even just a decade ago. Again, as someone who's dealing a lot with cultural history, I think we can say that like we can remember a movie like Adam Sandler, What's Up with Zohan? If I forgot the name, it was done I think like not a lot more than 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. I forgot the dates as a historian. That's what I'm supposed to do. But again, it's just, this kind of a consensus in Hollywood when you can make a nice movie about Israeli and Palestinians, and Israeli will be. So I'm not sure if that kind of movie will be able to produce today. Not necessarily because there's not a lot of people that will enjoy it in the US and Europe, but maybe just because it will not be a consensus enough for making a Hollywood movie or so forth. Definitely a movie like Exodus, which was done in the 60s with Paul Newman, and which basically was complete Zionist narrativization of the history, is probably will not become available today. So again, as an historian, I would say that we'll need to I would say the future is currently kind of open, and it's not necessarily clear what's the place of Israel actions, Israel reputation and Zionism reputation will be in the next couple of years. But and it will be interesting to see if it will be shaped by it will be shaped by external factors and Israeli leadership as well. So we'll have to wait.
How do you think that the Palestinian people in general, and of course, obviously, we're generalizing here, how do they deal with Zionism as what is being perceived today within the Palestinian community or the Palestinian territories, where today in Israel, um, Zionism is very much associated with the right rather than with the left. And the right today in Israel is is more extreme than usual, or the extreme right is more vocal than usual than before. It has more legitimacy within Israeli society and Israeli politics. And then what is what is becoming is that Zionism is really becoming very sort of like affiliated with the right wing movement of also, if we're talking about practicalities, whether it's annexing the West Bank, whether it's establishing Israeli settlements in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip. But then again, this conflicts with the idea that within Zionism, that the Jews should be a majority within their own country, within Israel. Because if Israel annexes the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the Jews are no longer a majority within that territory. So there's a conflict there within Zionism. How do you think the Palestinians um look at this conflict within
Yes,
Zionism?
so there's a few issues here. First, the obviously the rhetoric of the Israeli right today, which is in the government, we can even say ultra right, is very worrying. And as many right politics, it has the ability to internally exclude the other side, which means basically the Israeli left, saying them they're not Zionists and they're not Jews, or they forgot what is it to be Jews, a very infamous quote of Benjamin Netanyahu. Uh, it's of course not true in that sense. I think most most of the most of the Jews live in Israel are affiliated with Zionism as a political entity, as a political ideas and an ideology. But even more that are they are very much supporters of the state of Israel and the Israeli nationalists. They're not anti-Israel in any shape or form. In how's the Palestinian you see, that's a big question. No one really knows, and that's definitely one of the questions that they will have to understand in the going forward and decide for themselves for the future. So far, for 100 years, they're mostly in both sides, but also the Palestinians were not keen to accept the Jewish existence in the area, Zionist existence in the area as sovereign rulers with their own territories in the land. But I think in retrospect, we can say that one of the mistakes, at least Hamas leader Sinwar did in October 7, when he took that when he started this attack, was believing that the protest inside of Israel between the Israeli right and the Israeli left will weaken the support uh, or the loyalty of Israelis to their country and to their identity and culture and so forth. That was a grave mistake, but because it in many ways, for at least for a short period, it united the nation and to reveal that Israelis from all political spectrums, uh, or at least most political spectrums, are very much loyal to the state and the culture and identity and are willing to protect it.
Yeah, that's your last point there about maybe a lack of united Palestinian counter idea to Zionism is important because while even within and we're talking about just conversations about history and we're talking a lot about Zionism because of your recent book, but from a historical perspective, even if there were diversions within Zionism or different streams within Zionism, the Jewish community aiming for a national state was, by and large, Zionist. While today and throughout history, the Palestinian movement is divided between a secular and a religious um, stream, and both streams are very, very strong, but they find it difficult to find a common path to counter the Israeli state or existence or to establish themselves as a viable nation state with Israel, alongside Israel. From a historical perspective, that is really, really interesting how throughout those 100 years, the Palestinians couldn't find a one philosophy, um, a united philosophy rather, to lead them towards the state. I'm going for a last question. We talked a little bit about history is largely imagined or fixed into an existing sense of belief or a set of beliefs rather. And that on the face of it isn't a good thing because we take history, we play with it, and we put it on the table as a way forward. But can one spin this into a more peaceful existence rather than us versus them reality? Sort of like to shape history, if we're already shaping history, can we shape history into a more peaceful existence within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Of course, history is always a narrative, it's a story. Uh, in that way, it can easily change. And history changes. How it will change, I don't know, and I don't believe anyone knows. But it changes from history, as the cliche goes, always is written from the present to the past, not the other way around. We've seen, for example, during the 90s, when there was this euphoria of globalization, of liberalism prevail after the Cold War, at the end of history, what they see, so to speak, it also uh, um, led to the emergence of a peace talk between Israeli and the Palestinians. And a dream, at least who believed in this dream, it's an open question, but there was a dream in which there was a new Middle East and so forth. And then and the end of the conflict will end like the conflict in Ireland, which you mentioned at the start, ended at exactly the same time and under the same atmosphere. Uh, Obviously, this euphoria of the end of history is kind of ended after 9/11 in many ways.
Mhm.
And still, since then, also the Israeli-Palestinian conflict uh, entered a very different kind of impasse stage, which in Israel sometimes called managing the conflict. Uh, However, being optimistic in some ways, I believe both the war in Ukraine and the events in the current escalation of the conflict after the October 7 uh, um, uh, are signs, bloody signs, terrible signs, but also that history is already all again reopen itself into new possibilities and new ideas are taking place. Uh, in that way, it will be important to for anyone to fight for their ideas and their belief, as me, I hope most of our viewers in liberalism, and as in a hope that will also will be the next phase that will the next it will be also the next ideology that will shape our futures and the nearest future, uh, and create new opportunities for solving the conflict of the between Israel and Palestine, Israelis and Palestinians.
Right. So to sum up, we said there are two ways to solve or solve the conflict. Either a very ahistorical approach, so doesn't matter what happened thus far, we're just going to care about what happened, what's going to happen from now on, or molding the history into something that is um, that
It's
will open a way for.
it's two ways. It's two expression of the same thing, basically.
Mm,
It's like uh, we all live in an atmosphere, for example, and then we are under this cultural atmosphere experience in which we understand reality and the present and the past. We're able to shape the future, basically. Uh, uh, right now, for many Israeli and Palestinians, the way that the possibility of living together, it seems almost impossible. But ideas change very quickly. The country, as you know, where I'm sitting right now in Munich, in Germany, not that long ago in history, was the enemy of Jews. Right now, it might be the government for many decades, the most favorable countries to Jews to live in. Ideas change, cultural change, although it seems it doesn't. It changed, it sometimes changed drastically. We need to hope and also to fight it will change in our favor.
right, right, absolutely, absolutely, and it's important to say, um, when we started talking about this interview, I said I really thought that in the past I'd become a historian, and I didn't become a historian. I became a practitioner in counterterrorism,
It
and
is a correct career move. That's I'm glad.
Okay, thank you for confirming. So you hear all the time that Hamas can be defeated militarily, but cannot be defeated ideologically because Hamas is an idea. And I say it's complete nonsense. Um, Ideas change and die, um, and 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 new ideas come to life. Um, and history is shows that exactly that Hamas, the idea of Palestinian Sharia state on the entire land of Israel and beyond isn't from the beginning of times, and it won't be in the future. Ideas change, just as even Zionism, as we talked about, has changed throughout the ages. Um, so, so in terms of going back to what you said earlier, we need to work towards better ideas and more favorable ideas for the people of the region. That's my philosophy, rather than focusing on nation states, and that will also benefit, obviously, the nation states in the region. Dr. Ofer Idels, I thank you very much. This was very, very interesting. The link to your book will be published with the recording. It is free to download until when, Ofer?
December 20, I
Okay.
believe so.
Okay. So hurry up.
2024, if you're watching it in the distant future.
Yes. So yeah. So do take advantage of this opportunity. It's a
Yeah,
very, very interesting book.
thank you.
And thank you again, Dr. Ofer, and
Yeah,
all the best.
thank you for inviting me. It was my pleasure.
Good. Thank you. Bye bye.